The Unlikely Innovators with Mike Commito and Steve Gravel. Presented by Cambrian R&D and the Center for Smart Mining.
Okay, we're back, and this is another episode of The Unlikely Innovators coming at you live, broadcasting from the Silicon Crater. But we shouldn't call it that, of course, as our next guest will tell you. Is that right, Mike?
Yeah, I mean that's a horrible nickname, but yeah, Dan Breznitz, Dr. Dan Breznitz, I should say as well, joined us on the Unlikely Innovators this week as part of his stopover in Sudbury. And you and I have been on this bandwagon for a while, thanks to BetaKit, the Silicon Valley of the North, or Silicon Valley North, sorry, when people try to come up with what we should be calling these vibrant tech hubs in Canada. When I think Dan hammered home that we should resist these comparisons to Silicon Valley because you can't recreate that model in other parts of the world. And when you have, it doesn't work. It leads to inequity and all sorts of other challenges. And I think, one of the things that rung true for us in hearing him talk, at the event that was organized by the Greater Sudbury Development Corporation was Canada should be looking to other countries if it wants to try to build up that vibrant tech, culture that we see in other places. And I think Taiwan and Finland were two examples of that. We do talk about that quite a bit in our conversation with Dan that we're going to get to in a moment. So I think that's great, but no, we're not broadcasting from the Silicon Crater. It's even hard to say with the straight face, but we're broadcasting from Sudbury, Ontario, which is, what would you, if you were, without using that terminology and pulling from, a tech hub or a vibrant place that already exists, how would you describe Sudbury to somebody like Dan, who admittedly was only here for a second visit? And the first time he was here, he got off the plane, was shuttled to the conference center, and then shuttled back to the airport. So he admittedly hasn't seen a lot of Sudbury. I know that he's studied it from afar and he understands, the resources and the industries at play here. But how would you describe Sudbury, and maybe through the lens of the Center for Smart Mining, the mining service supply sector here?
Yeah, I don't think I would resist encapsulating it into like a moniker or nickname. I think this is what I'll say. I'm not going to get too technical or in depth, but every mining conference I've been to across Canada, and indeed when I've been on holiday elsewhere talking to people who know something about mining, people that know anything about commodities in general, know the name Sudbury. And that's because of the rich history of not only the mining piece, but also the incredible talented companies that have resulted from the mining supply and service sector that's developed over the last 30, 35, 40 years. So I think Sudbury almost speaks for itself in that way. What I think was good to have Dan's perspectives on is if Sudbury wants to maintain that position and indeed transform itself into what it's next going to be known for, which will include mining and commodities, we really need to take a look and re-engineer and reverse engineer what we want to be if we look at what Sudbury might look like in the next 20 years and how would we have gotten there. And I think that was the really refreshing perspective that Dan shared, not only in his 2 days with leaders here in Sudbury that we were fortunate enough to be part of, but also what he said in this episode.
Yeah, so I think maybe what I'll do is I'm going to read the bio for Dan, because this was actually, we were fortunate enough to interview him in person at the Glencore Center for Innovation here at Cambrian College before he caught his flight. Luckily, his flight was delayed, so we had a lot of time to have a chat with him and then take him for a tour of our facilities here. But for those who are just tuning in for the first time and aren't aware of Dan's work, Dan Breznitz is a university professor and Munk Chair of Innovation Studies at the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy, with a cross appointment in the Department of Political Science at the University of Toronto, where he is also the co-director of the Innovation Policy Lab and a senior fellow at Massey College. In addition, he is a fellow of CIFAR, where he co-directs the program on innovation, equity, and the future of prosperity. I could go on and on about Dan's bio, but I'm going to shorten it. And the last thing I'll say is he's also the author of the book, which you can't see because I have a filter on, of course, but the book is Innovation in Real Places, Strategies for Prosperity in an Unforgiving World. And I'm not going to say anything more than that, but I will say that I bring up the book in the podcast. You'll have to wait to see how Dan reacts to my admission to him. So we're going to go right to Dan in our chat in the innovation room here at the Glencore Center.
All right, we're back and we're joined by Dr. Dan Breznitz. Thanks so much for doing this. Obviously, we were able to catch you while you were in town speaking to the community here. One of the things that we sort of ask our guests really early on when they join us for this time is sort of like, what did you want to be when you grow up? But I wanted to just pick at this a bit first. One obviously doesn't wake up in the morning and plan to become a researcher and scholar focused on innovation. How did your career path sort of develop into the current state? Match what you sort of expected early on in your early formative years?
So by mistake, if you want me to be honest. Yeah. Right now, what I want to be when I grow old is retired. But back then, I never thought I'll be a professor. So first, I didn't even bother going to children. Don't listen to me, but I never even bothered to start my undergrad degree until I was 23. So obviously until that time, I did not think I'll be a professor. Mm-hmm. Then when I started, I also opened a software company because back then they were not called startups, they were called software companies. So I thought I'll have a software company. And I thought that if I'll do any studies, because I'm doing software, if at all, I'll do something about philosophy. And look what happened. Yeah. So, but way it sort of happened, which I think is an interesting story to a degree, also when we speak about innovation and change and why it fascinated me. So I got an offer from MIT. So I left my software company and my dreams of becoming a billionaire and went to MIT. And at MIT, I did not think that I'll do anything about innovation. I mean, innovation and, PhD, there. And then around my third year, I went back to Israel. And as I said, before I started my PhD, I started a software company, which we called a software company because nobody knew what is a startup. And we were very young at the time. And people understood that there is a change in the air, so they agreed to talk with us. But we constantly got pushed back. You're too young for us to work with you. If you can even imagine people saying that. There was no VC, so we need to develop a business plan. So I was by far the worst programmer. So I was demoted to be the CEO, which really was seen as a demotion.
Sure.
And I needed to devise a business plan in which we have enough consultancy in order for us to have some money to pay for a small R&D team, which is our ideas. Now 7 years have passed. I'm coming back from MIT, and I found a place where there's not only startups galore, more VCs than, more or less per capita anywhere on earth, but people in high school could actually talk with me and knowingly about a term sheet with venture capital. So I was like, what happened? How that transformation happened? So started to look at that and realized that a lot of it happened because of policy, because of government intervention. And then I said, okay, that's very interesting. Can I see it in other places? And landed up on Taiwan, but also Ireland. And I don't know how many people remember, but Ireland was the Celtic tiger. But even more interestingly, back then, people talk about the three I's, Ireland, India, and Israel, as being the new superpowers of software. Just to show you what people knows, right? Because there's no more three I's. But I look at all three of them and saw how there's a very different roles for the government or public policy to devise the growth trajectory of those three countries that before the government stepped in were rather poor and not very highly educated. And look what happened then. And once you start, you get stuck in that train, and then looking at innovation, I started to get more and more worried, especially, and then I did a book on China, again, by mistake. It was supposed to be a case study. It ended up as a whole book, comparing three regions of China. And then I started to get very worried because by then you saw the impact on inequality. So if 2000, everybody in Israel and Ireland and Taiwan and almost in the US were so keen about innovation, it's going to create massive economic growth, everybody will be happy. By around 2008, it was very clear that not everybody is happy in all those places. So you compare Taiwan, where it's actually probably much more equal today than what it was, and Finland, where I did a lot of work, to Israel, the US, where you could say that Israel and Silicon Valley might be the best miracle of innovation, but they're also the best miracle of inequality creation. And on the other side, you see Finland and Taiwan. And that's how I started to get more and more involved with question of innovation and distribution and equity and inequality. And probably my next book will also happen as a mistake, but that's how I got here.
Well, it seems to be a pretty happy accident so far.
Some unlikely journeys from chapters to full books. And
Yeah.
obviously we have your latest book here in front of us now, The Innovation in Real Places, Strategies for Prosperity in an Unforgiving World. And I admit I haven't read the whole book yet. I started, but
He sounds like one of my students.
I'm going to get to it.
By the way, just so you'll know that in most of my syllabus, it's actually an example for participation. You get bonus. And if you start your question or remarks, but I haven't read the materials, but I think that does not count as participation. Just saying.
We know that's from
fair.
graduate work, Mike.
But I will say that I will draw from what I have read so far, and I'm going to use an example here. So we're talking to you now. We're at Cambrian R&D, which is the applied research arm of Cambrian College. And 5 years ago, we were actually called Cambrian Innovates. And we rebranded partly because we felt as though innovation was kind of a term that I think a lot of people were familiar with, but a lot of people also thought that, well, I'm not doing high-tech stuff, so I'm not innovative, or I wouldn't be a fit to work with Cambrian Innovates. Maybe this isn't something I should consider. And so we thought that, R&D, I think, is more in line with what we're doing here, and it still is a term that resonates with people. But I think the big reason why we wanted to move away from Innovates was because I think there was a misconception among people that that's only reserved for firms and people who are doing high-tech stuff. And in the opening pages of your book, you talk about innovation versus invention and how, innovation is not necessarily always just a novel thing, and it's definitely not always high-tech. So can you maybe touch on, the concept of innovation, the term that you use in the book, and how it's different from innovation or invention, sorry.
Sure. So, and I think that's related also to why we should care about innovation and why I care about innovation. And I care about innovation because it's the only way, especially in a wealthy, developed economy like Canada, to have sustained growth and prosperity and well-being. Okay, now let's go in, and that's why we should care about that. But innovation is not invention. So invention is the act of coming up with a new idea. And as a matter of fact, I can go all the way and have a patent. And people think they innovated because they have a patent. They have not innovated at all. And indeed, on the patent, if you look at the legal term, is the inventor. Mm-hmm. They invented something. In order to innovate, you actually have, it's an act of taking ideas and putting them, if we talk about the economy, in the market, either as new products and new services, so what you call high tech, but also on improving them, also on combining them, also on figuring out new uses for them, also in figuring out how to produce them better, and also let us not forget, because I'm sure you at least heard about a company called Apple and the iPhone and the iTunes and that. Also how to sell them and how to service them. All along those different stages of production of both goods and services, you innovate. But you innovate when you take ideas and make them to reality. Okay, and that's the act of innovation.
Yeah, and I think maybe So I want to ask you about some of the work that you're doing with the Canadian Innovation Corporation, or that you have done. But I really want to just take a second to talk a bit about what you've been talking about the last couple of days with our group here, because one of the things, the examples you mentioned in Taiwan and Finland and all of the other lovely examples you went through, one thing that I was thinking in my mind was, how much of the planning that goes into those economies or those regions that have success in a particular trade or sector, how much of that is deliberate and how much of that is a matter of taking advantage of happenstance? So I know that's a bit of a stretch from what Mike just asked you, but that's something that just sort of came to my mind when I was thinking about that, because what we've been doing the last couple of days is trying to turn what we have into here into something deliberate about what we want to be when we grow up, so to speak, as an economy. So maybe just if you could reflect on that.
Sure. So, because I said philosophy, let me use actually Machiavelli, who people think was an evil person, but that is incorrect. And in his discourses about the Republic and about democracy, which, by the way, he thought was the best way to govern people, he exactly said that. He said, of course you need to have fortuna or fortune, but the people who actually use fortuna are those that are prepared to have fortune. And when that moment of fortune comes, they know what to do. And that's, I think, the best way to think about what Taiwan has done, what Israel has done, Finland, Ireland. They have decided, they figure out that they have a problem. They have decided upon what it is that they want to do. And indeed, strangely enough, if you don't look at the specific technologies, but you look at the model of how they want their economy to look like, it's rather similar to that old vision. So Israel, and it called it that way, wanted a science-based industry because nobody knew what high-tech was. But when you read how they define it as a multitude of new companies that go to the market with new products. Services, nobody talked about services in 68. And indeed, that's what happened. Of course, we did not envision venture capital because it didn't exist. Of course, we did not envision what the bad things that would happen. But they envisioned a whole array of new industries. And by the way, they didn't even think about ICT in the time. And they still aren't. If you look at how they do, they are sponsoring R&D, which leads to new exportable products by companies in all sectors, with the aim that will become the competitive advantage of Israel. That was the plan. You look at Taiwan, and Taiwan says we can't compete in novel R&D. And we can't compete with Japan or Korea. China was still not part of the game. We don't have those deep packets. We don't have those massive companies. Where can we play? We can play where you improve stuffs, where you become the OEMs and the most important OEMs and ODMs, on design manufacturer, for the world best companies in new industries and old industries based on what we will call second generation R&D. And then you look at how they planned it. They said, okay, so for example, in semiconductors, because we talked about bikes yesterday, semiconductors, they said, okay, we are not going to, back then it was a memory battles, if you remember, first the US was defeated by Japan, and then Japan was defeated by Korea. They said, we can go there. Instead, what we want is, it was then called ISIC, right? Application specific. So basically chips to do things, your car keys, whatever. So we develop a design, but again, not novel, but once somebody else proves that there's money, we can design a much better chip doing that. And then the skills to manufacture, fabrication. They develop those two skills and then diffuse them to the industry. And lo and behold, they got more or less what they wanted. So if anyone in Taiwan tells you, we know that TSMC and a fabless semiconductor factory will be the wave of the future. No, they did not. What they said is, we need to focus on manufacturing capabilities, design capabilities, and because of that, it makes sense for us to have a fabless company. And if it also makes a lot of money, great. But to think of And then they built it, and then they saw, as you said, luck and fortune, and they built it to become one of the most critical companies worldwide right now. But when they open it, the private companies in Taiwan refused to co-invest because nobody believed it would work. Okay, so
yeah, sorry, this is just coming to me now. Also, so we've again spent some time today with some community leaders, and for posterity, this isn't, I guess, an evergreen episode that can be listened to anyways, but or always like evergreen. But when you say they in Taiwan or you say they in Israel, who are the people that are? Who's going? Like, so we had good leaders with us today. Who's coalescing around these things and making them happen? Who is the they, in other words, in these stories?
So the they in those stories, in those two stories, right? We can go country by country. While they were on the public side, so from both political leaders, but especially what you now call civil or public servants, and people from the industry itself. They had the backing, and that's important, of the highest political leaders at certain points of time, which basically created an environment in which they can work and experiment and figure it out. But it was a not very large group of leaders who really, really cared about innovation and growth. Okay, and let's, by the way, remember that back then, everybody assumed innovation equals growth equals prosperity for everybody. The question of this might lead to inequality was just nobody knew that they even need to ask it. Okay, but you're talking about the very small groups, and if you look at the tools and the ideas, they actually came from both sides, but the public leaders or policy leaders understood that it's their role to take the collective ideas and make them into reality and lead, especially since, as you know, R&D and innovation are really high risk, high uncertainty. So under free market conditions, you would not expect, especially if you're a poor economy, you would not expect your own private companies to actually innovate a lot. So you want them to innovate, you have to put public resources to make it less risky for them.
On that note, I mean, I think Steve was going to ask this, but I'll jump in now. That when you're talking about using public funds to de-risk innovation, obviously you've been talking recently about the forthcoming Canadian Innovation Corporation, and obviously where we are at Cambrian, we use a lot of public dollars to help companies de-risk that innovation and work with us. We use NSERC, IRAP, Canada Foundation for Innovation, all these other sorts of great funders that I think at the root of it is to help companies get into the game and to innovate. But so there's a lot of these structures that already exist. We know that over the years that not all of these have paid off, I think, the way that they were pitched initially. But what can the CIC do to not only build on what we have, but also maybe not get rid of the things that do work, but kind of help companies de-risk and help kind of spur innovation further in this country?
Okay, so let's just go two step back, or one step into the different direction. So first of all, because we just mentioned it, let's remember two things, right? Innovation is the engine of growth and prosperity. It happens, and the reason why we really care about it is what economists would call positive spillovers, meaning that the innovator or a company doing the R&D actually cannot appropriate everything. Once you do the R&D, there will be all those other effects throughout that will create a lot more growth, a lot more welfare, but not all of them, be captured basically by money and knowledge and by the innovators. That also means, together with a high risk and high uncertainty, that you would not expect in a free market conditions for companies and the individual entrepreneurs to actually innovate to the level that you want from as a public, as a society. Because A, they don't know if they'll succeed. It might cost them a lot more. And even if they succeed, they cannot what's called appropriate, even with patent. And that's the reason why we have patent laws and IP laws and all the rest. But even under that, they will not appropriate all the profits, right? And they are also, because of various regulations, we talked a lot about it, for example, in mining, they don't know if they will even be allowed to sell the products, even if somebody wants it. So without public intervention, which can be funding, like de-risking, it can be various sets of regulation, it could be IP rules, we would not expect enough innovation. Okay, so and you will not find any economist on earth arguing with that. Okay, people got Nobel laureates in economics to prove this, right? Okay, that's one. The second is Canada. Okay, so and the reason I put that on the table is that in Canada we made a mistake which we should own to. And until 2001, if you look at all our figures of innovation, R&D, use of new knowledge, engagement of new knowledge by our business sector, we were going in the right direction. And you would see it in figures like business investment R&D. You will see it in things like Human Development Index, we're number one. Complexity of our industry, which is how our industry is sophisticated. We were doing very well. Around 2001, it all started to fall, and it's falling. It's still falling. We are the only OECD country that it's still falling. Okay? That does not happen in 2001. It really started around 96, which, by the way, if you're wondering, is the year in which NAFTA came to be. Mm-hmm. But it's also the year in which we as a country completely bought into what is now called the Washington Consensus and free trade. And what we did without writing it, but basically doing it, we destroyed most of our ability to do what we now call industrial and innovation policy, if you look at the federal level, and decided to believe in the market. So we pumped a huge amount of money over the years into the creation of talent, education, our public R&D, and all the rest, and strengthened SHRED, which is the end, right? The tax, and assume that somehow, by magic, there'll be a lot of great ideas coming from our universities, and because there's a tax incentive, somehow companies will even understand those ideas, commercialize them, create a lot of innovation. And lo and behold, it will happen. So, as I told you before, any good economist of innovation would have told you that this is not going to work. I mean, the expectation is that you will fail. More than that, you just had the free trade, commodity boom, China, all the rest. So it makes even less sense for Canadian businesses to invest in R&D and innovation. And you just started to supply them with a huge amount of high-skilled labor for relatively cheap prices. So what they will do with that is, instead of using them to innovate or do R&D, and you can see it in the figures, for example, R&D employment, you can now use overqualified human beings to operate on old equipment with old technology and still have productivity gains that are just enough to have unbelievable profit margins. So it's not that the managers are stupid or evil. They're doing exactly what, if you're a cold-blooded analyst and economist, expect them to do. We, as a country, that's the incentives we gave our business sectors. And that's exactly what the business sector has done, apart from, the new community of startups. And we've done it for 30 years. So now it's basically our business model. We now have multiple companies that, even if they want to, they don't know how to innovate or how to engage with R&D. And into that vacuum, by the way, came a lot of multinationals, and then the Globe and Mail and Toronto Star can write evil things about them. But again, shouldn't happen as a surprise. There's a huge amount of ideas, and no local companies will take the opportunity. Somebody will. Okay? We now need to own that failure and says we need to fix that. The problem is the private market. You talked about R&D, for example. So I'll call it engagement with innovation, R&D, intellectual property, understanding how to do that, and create a corporation crown corporation, so independent from government, because you need to act fast and get better talent, or business talent, sorry, not better. And to be able to just attack the problem, because it's now systemic problem. So if anyone tells you, and we have tried, as you said, that this one little program will fix everything in our business sector, she's either delusional or lying, or a lobbyist, or all three. And that Crown Corporation, the CIC, has a metrics of moving those things up, leading to exportable products and services, and basically trying, educated guess on what would work in programs, employing them, making decision very quickly in things like funding in 12 weeks, see what works, grow it up, see what doesn't work, stop it, which again is very difficult to do if you're the government. Can you even think about a government program that was ever stopped?
Especially mid-year.
Especially mid-year, and especially a program that gave money to anyone.
Yeah.
Right? And not only that, we try to somehow, I don't want to use the word rationalize, but make it logical. And then we look at IRAP, and we saw that the people with the best set of skills do exactly what we talk about from the evaluation, but also knowing both business and government, and then coming up with ideas for the CEO to implement. They're already part of IRAP. Mm-hmm. So it became very logical to merge those two together. And also, I would hope that the ITAs would now feel empowered to not just act as an ITA, but act as an agent of innovation for at least new policies, for whoever the CEO will be, right?
That's great. You took us way back, and then you zoomed in and actually hit it anyways. So that's great. I know that a lot of our clients in the R&D world use IRAP, so they're really any sort of efficiencies and improvements is just going to be good for the end user anyways. So by the time this podcast airs, you'll have completed this visit to Sudbury. One of the global leaders, obviously, in mining, Sudbury. What are some of your takeaways here? And you'll have already boarded your plane, so you could say whatever you want by the time people hear this. I know that you and I had a couple of discussions about, specificity when we want to talk about what we want to be, in the future. What can we learn from other resource economies is the other thing specifically, because from your time in Finland, that's an interesting piece, but other resource-based economies. So maybe just reflect on that, impressions of the Sudbury Basin, opportunities that you've seen in your short time here.
Okay, so
and you can be honest, because again, you'll be gone by then.
I'll be gone. Yes, Toronto's not far enough.
They'll find you.
But let me try to be provocative. So in retrospect, it might have been the best thing that happened to Sudbury, that the two big mining companies are gone. And the reason is because when you do it properly, which is more or less what happened in Sudbury, you release all those resources to create a much thicker array of companies, what we call suppliers, that are actually using knowledge and development and offering other services. And why is that important? And is that if Canada wants to continue to develop, we must start to move away from relying on being the place where we dig a hole in the ground, take something out, stabilize it if we need stabilization, and ship it as quickly as possible to Norway, US, or China, and instead do something with all our extremely highly educated, maybe the most highly educated workforce in the world, on those things. That's one. And I think we have example in bad example in both oil and forestry in this country and mining, in which we have constantly been giving opportunity to do more, and instead we focused on just digging things or taking things from the ground and shipping them somewhere else. The other thing that happens around it, speaking about Finland, for example, is that you can build a whole industry around the equipment that goes to that industry. In the case of Finland, it was forestry. So if you visit British Columbia, which by far has more forests than anyone else, but you actually look at all their equipment and the technology that they use, you'll find out that mostly is from Finland. And the reason that the Finnish, speaking about the role of both public policy and local companies, realize that they're suffering from competition, and that their only way of surviving a forestry but also build industry around it is to infuse it in knowledge, figure out the equipments around it, figure out how to use it for different products, or for example biofuels, and then making all those other industry global industries. Okay? Sudbury and Canada has been giving basically a lottery ticket. And we're gaining a lottery ticket by the green tech revolution. Sadly, we did not understand that this is coming until the Americans told us, and I'm going to be blunt, till the Americans decided that we need to have a critical mineral strategy. Mm-hmm. The words critical mineral strategy did not appear in any government document, either federal or provincial. About 3 minutes after the American basically told us what they want us to do, then we started thinking about it. And I think that's a big, big problem. But we still have an opportunity to use this and decide what we want. I mean, we have all the minerals here in Sudbury. Around Sudbury, there should be between 16 to 40 mines. But apart from those mines, what other industries can we develop? Especially since, by the way, I assume that people outside Sudbury will also hear it podcast, so they might not know that in mines now there are no miners. It's automated. There are no people that go with a pickaxe and they dig stuff. Most of the people employed in mining are actually what you would call technicians or engineers. They have extremely interesting job, very technologically savvy. When they go to a mine, they wear wearables that are light years ahead than the wearables that you hear about outside the mines, that gives them all the health benefits. Automated vehicles are things that the mines have been using 15 years ago, before Uber and Google thought that you should have an automated taxi. Why aren't we not playing more in those industries instead of just saying, okay, you can dig your hole here?
Yeah.
So I think Sudbury has all that potential, partly because of what happened with the two companies, partly because there are already 300 companies here, partly because of Cambrian and the two other, one other college and the university. But if Cambrian won't get its act together and decide what it wants to be when, as you said, grow old, I mean, there'll be a lot of money made by digging things from Sudbury and moving them somewhere else. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because there's gradations of how much we can win, right? And I was talking to Mike on the way back from an event earlier today, and you know, there's money, as you say, there's money to be made if there's just new holes in the ground. But what a missed opportunity if we look back in 15 years and that's all we have. You know what I mean? Like St. Thomas, Ontario can build batteries, but we have hundreds of years of metallurgists here that can't help with battery factories. I mean, it makes so much sense to do things locally. I always make the joke, well, we should just change our name to Bécancour, Quebec, and then we'll start to see battery companies want to set up here like they are in Trois-Rivières. But you know, like, to me, it's that sort of small cabal of people like you see in these other communities and examples that have to really plant a flag here and say, this time it will be different. This won't be the shipbuilding industry early on in Canadian history. This won't be softwood lumber. This is going to be something different this time, right? And
Well, that's almost kind of like where we can go with this next, because I was trying to tie this together, and I think it'll work. So bear with me.
I trust
on this.
you.
And,
I trust you.
We've been doing enough episodes together.
It's good that you trust him because I don't know him, so I don't know if I should trust him.
Well, watch this.
He haven't read my book.
Well,
so,
yeah, we're gonna put a lot of pressure on him now because he's really.
Yeah, well, one of the things you were talking about the other night was, and Steve and I have actually talked about this as well, and we've obviously seen outlets like BetaKit kind of bemoan the idea of Silicon Valley of the North. Like, they used to sell T-shirts that were with Silicon Valley of the North, and they were crossed out, and then just Canada at the bottom, because we are Canada. And that you talked about how, like, we need to kind of shift away from trying to emulate Silicon Valley, because it's not going to work here the way that it's worked there. And you talked about Finland and Taiwan as examples that we should be looking to. I mean, from my perspective here in Sudbury, Finland makes too much sense because similar geography, similar climate, similar resource economy, and even in Sudbury, we've got a nice, vibrant Finnish population.
I married one of them, right?
Yeah, so we've got that going for us. But with this critical minerals opportunity now, it's almost like not a do-over, because we're not doing it all over again, but we have an enormous opportunity where what can we do to look at a country like Finland now, knowing that we haven't gone too far down the road yet? What are some of the things that we should be doing now, so that when we do look back in 15 years, we don't say, if only we were like Finland when this started, we wouldn't have missed out on all these like additional opportunities, spin-offs, right? So
first of all, and I think you already are doing it, is bring the leaders of, let's call it the community, together with the elected and public, but also the leaders so you people, business leaders, and devise the shared vision. And when I say shared vision, I'm not talking about, we need to have a lot, we don't have 300 companies, we need 6. A shared vision like the Finnish or the Taiwanese. Those are the kind of industries and stages that we want to play in around mining or around other things, because we have the wearables already because of mining. We might want to be also the wearable capital of the world.
The industrial wearable capital, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
But make a decision and then figure out if that is what I want to be. How does Sudbury looks like in 10, 15 years in terms of what companies you have here, but even more importantly, not just the name of the companies and what they do, but what capabilities and capacity they have. And then reverse engineer it and say, okay, what are the things we need to do in the next 2 to 3 years, your windows of opportunity, to have a chance of moving in that direction. And of course, the world change, and you need to change a plan. But if you started to work like that, and you think about it as a set of capabilities, or offering that you give a global networks, right? And where you are, you can start planning. If you won't do that, and will just allow market forces or whatever they are, because they're not market forces, and I'll explain in a minute. If you don't make a decision, so a non-decision is actually in the global economy a decision, because you have decided to do what other people decided that you should do. It's time that we become active and stop being so reactive and stop assuming that the Americans know best what Canadians should do.
Yeah, it's an important point, and I think it's almost like we're always relying on, they always quote the amount of daily trade we have with the United States, and that sort of gives us the fear of what, like, wanting to acquiesce to whatever that is. But I really like the idea of thinking about capabilities. So if, for example, we really want a battery plant or a cathode and anode facility, what are the capabilities when that prospective or that dream facility is up? Who's working there? What capacity do they have? What funding did they have to raise? What financial instrument would they have had to use to build that? And then that's what we need to start planning for now.
Yeah, and what kind of suppliers they need to have around them in order to succeed, because those kind of companies cannot work in a vacuum.
And we might have some of them, which makes our sort of our starting point sweeter and closer to it, but we probably don't have quite a lot of the suppliers too that are required. So yeah, it's an important thing to do, and I think that's what hopefully I think your presence here is sort of refocused, how to tackle that because of the places you've studied. One thing I wanted to just this is a bit of a digression, but I wanted you to talk a bit about VCs because I used to work at Ontario Centres of Excellence, and we had a co-investment fund there. And it seems to me like, gosh, we were pushing, get angel, get VC so that you can co-invest with us. And then, a lot of those companies, and I don't work there anymore, but a lot of those companies we didn't see ever again, or if we did, they were huge, gobbled up by someone else and went on, and they're not household names at all. But could you talk a bit about the sort of unfulfilled promises of the VC? I know we're sort of dancing around it a little bit, but just can you talk a bit about the failings of that?
Sure. So let's again put it in historical perspective. What we now call VC, venture capital, and specifically the model that we talk about, which is originally the American model of VCs, is the latest in a series of, let's call them vehicle or organizations with specific rules of how societies decided to channel capital into new industries and new activities. And venture capital appeared because of action of the American government. Okay? And if you think about the history of industrialization and new innovation, you could see that new vehicles to do that appeared first in England, then in France, then in Germany, are different in Japan and Korea. So VCs is just the latest of those trends, and it was created in the US that has very specific financial markets and very specific ideas on how you push innovation, but also how you make money from that innovation. And the VC has been, for a long while, actually quite successful. But it has its own limitations, and there are a few of them. One, if you look at the history of what we now call VCs, it worked very well only in industries where the time horizon is actually quite short. So 5 to 10 years. So ICT, information communication technology, and biotech, and especially in biotech after we and the American changed the laws about what are you allowed to have to make a public company, with real products that make money or just promises, right? And how you evaluate them. Also, the world has changed. And what we talked about, the fragmentation of production. So think, for example, about the VC back then and a small company which you might have heard about called Apple. Back then, when the venture capital gave money to Apple also needed to have production facilities around Silicon Valley. So it was in other areas of California and Colorado. So when you have VCs, even with all its failing that I'll talk about in a minute, you actually assumed that if you do the higher level R&D, you also, all boats will be rising. You create jobs for other kind of people and skills. Once you have a fragmentation of production, and you can see it in Apple, you at best has some of the R&D and design in Silicon Valley and a few other places, but all those other jobs are not created in the US, apart maybe from those for people who work in the Apple store. And now when you look at VCs in the American model, they basically look for companies, and rightly so, by the way, they need to make money. And I mean, when I invest in the VC, I expect them to make money for me, not to change society for the better. And the way that they do it is they pick companies that they think from between 5 to 7 years will make at least an order of magnitude, probably 2 orders of magnitude profits, assuming that they will make 10 bets, out of which one would actually pay for all the rest and give ROI that are so high compared to every other investment opportunity that they can raise the next fund. What that means is that they basically looking for business models where you employ the R&D engineers, and your real product, it's not your product, it's your company. And the company needs to be sold either by M&A or to a public offering on a stock, but basically be sold so the VCs will get the money. anything that delays this or means that you need to have more capital equipment like manufacturing is pushed aside and offshored. So you now have created a system which takes the people we shouldn't really worry about. So the graduates of our best engineering schools, so people that will be fine, whatever, they get to have unbelievably interesting jobs with unbelievably good wages, plus a lottery ticket, which called stock or stock options. So instead of millionaires, they'll be billionaires. The VCs, few lawyers, some celebrity chefs having wonderful time, but they don't create jobs for anyone else. Because even if a company is successful and become big, all those other jobs will happen somewhere else in the world.
So that's the hollowing out of that sort of middle class then in these places, because you're not doing any of the manufacturing or packaging where the ideas are happening in Silicon Valley. Is that sort of how that links to inequity?
Yes.
Yeah.
And it's if you go to the extreme, it's the top R&D engineers get wonderful jobs. No one else does, right?
Mm-hmm.
And if you then go to a place like Canada or like Israel, where most of the money for venture capital actually come from the US or somewhere else, when you have a financial exit, all that money goes back to where it come from. So you don't even get a lot of profits and a lot of money staying in your economy. So the fact that we have been pushing for a very specific model of VCs, and then as a country and as a province have been pushing that model of VCs and financial exit on industries where it doesn't make sense, is one of our problems. So VCs are a very useful tools if you want to make money in what I call stage one innovation in, ICT and biotech. If you want to operate in mining and mine equipment, if your game is manufacturing or fabrication, even in health sciences, VCs are not the right vehicle for you to get the capital you need, the connection you need, but also the time you need. They need to sell you. Mm-hmm. And people keep forgetting that and think that VCs, instead of economic development, let's just have 2 VCs. It doesn't work.
That's great, because I'm writing an article for the Canadian Mining Journal next month on the state of the investment space in mining technology. So
you did your homework for you.
Yeah, that's good.
But Dan, you've been so generous with your time. Before we let you go, though, we did want to have a little bit of fun.
Okay.
And I will borrow a concept from your book that I have read, in the pages that I have read. So over to our left is a Jenga set, or at least in this case, a Jenga Ultimate set. So what can Jenga tell us about innovation?
So it's what we just talked about, right? So again, let's go back to our example of Apple. The old Apple, and even before that, the old Ford, if people remember that car company, was like a Jenga. So everything that you needed to have as a company, from design and R&D to, in the case of Ford, even mines and rubber plantation and the train that leads to them and the power station were all owned by the Ford company, moving everything into one locale, vertical. But then it also means that if you had any kind of innovation, a lot of what it did stayed there. What we did is a fragmentation of production. And when we started to do that, all our models of how you create prosperity started to crash, right? But we didn't feel it, because just like what you're doing now, we took one and one keep on, but at some point it breaks. And we are now in a stage, and at least we figure this out, and the Americans figure it out, that our model of innovation has basically come crashing. Innovation leading to prosperity has basically come crashing down like a Jenga. And we need to figure out what models can lead us to both innovation and equity and prosperity. And like your kids, we're still doing that, hoping that our new model is not going to fall. But I like this ultimate one. There's multiple colors.
Yeah.
Probably a lot of rules that make it ultimate.
Yeah, I like to think the thing about Jenga is it was pretty straightforward in its original.
Yeah.
You know,
We definitely don't have the rule book for that anymore. Or if there was a die, I'm assuming there was the color coded die. It's gone.
Yeah.
No, I think we should just play Jenga, the original.
Yeah, I agree. My hope is that the next time we talk, it's not all been coming crashing down in the Sudbury area, and that we have taken advantage of all the advantages we have. But Dan, thank you so much for joining us on the show, and thanks for stopping by Sudbury. Hope you had a good time.
I had a wonderful time, and I was told that I should come again in the summer where your 300 lakes are more inviting.
That's exactly right. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Thanks a lot. You can't imagine how fast we just changed our shirts after this. Of course, I'm kidding. We're recording the conclusion of this lovely chat we just had with Dan on another day. But that was a fantastic chat. I mean, sometimes it takes external perspectives. Someone, I don't want to say worldly, but as well traveled as Dan, who's studied innovation ecosystems around the world and has had the benefit of time to see how those things have played out, specifically in Israel, and how those learnings can go into the strategic planning we do at a local level. So it was a refreshing time, and we even got to mention Jenga, and you could see how I sloppily took one of the pieces off at the end.
But you didn't even put it back on the top. You put it to the side.
I did.
No, you didn't.
Yeah, you cajoled me for it, and I put it on top.
Oh, you did. Okay.
Yeah,
Well, yeah, because at first I saw you place the piece beside the tower, and I'm like, that's not how you play Jenga.
Yeah, I mean,
Would you
it's
just, like,
ultimate
take
Jenga.
No, that's not ultimate. It's Jenga Ultimate.
Yeah, you're right.
As we confirmed.
I thought I was playing Ultimate Jenga, but it was in fact Jenga Ultimate. So the rules for Ultimate Jenga might be different.
Yeah, but no, I don't think it would have worked. But my idea for the episode was to was to have the Jenga tower in between the three of us, and as we talked, we would play Jenga, which I think visually made a lot of sense. But like, if you're an audio viewer listening to this right now, you wouldn't have seen any of that, and all of a sudden you would have heard the crash of the Jenga tower coming down. It would have been terribly distracting for everybody involved.
Absolutely.
So it was good that we killed that idea and just had it there as a prop for that final question, because again, we try to bring you the best, and so sometimes we got to leave those ideas on the cutting room floor.
We didn't kill the idea. It never made it. We didn't even greenlight the idea.
Well, I guess it wasn't like I had the idea and it was it didn't get adopted.
Yeah.
Rightly didn't get adopted.
Yeah, but I think if 10% of the things that Dan talked about these last few days makes its way into public policy, I think we'll be moving in the right direction. And one thing that I did take from what he said, not only with our chat today, but what he did reflect on over the last couple of days, is that we have to be very specific in what we want to do. It's not just enough to say our population in 20 years will be over 200,000, or there will be more manufacturing here. It'll be what kind of manufacturing, and where do those 200,000 people now work, and what are the capabilities of the organizations that we'll attract here? What are the specific capabilities of those organizations? What are they going to be, and how do we service them? And that's really instructive for us at the college even.
Yeah, no, and I think that we're on the right track. I think especially at the city with the leadership we have in place now, that I think the city is committed to this plan, and I think the specifics of that plan. So as they say, time will only tell where this goes, but I think this is not, a discussion that's just going to happen and then get mothballed. I think it's going to move forward. Looking forward to seeing, what role we could play in that. And again, it'd be great to have Dan come back to see, are we moving that ball down the field? I know that he wants to come back in the summer. That's probably not enough time, but we'll welcome him whenever he wants. And I think maybe a few years down the road to see, have we taken, what he said and what we talked about at that forum and moved it forward. And I do think we will. So, but until then, thank you for listening to the Unlikely Innovators, which I've heard is the Silicon Valley of podcasts. Which of course that doesn't work. And so please stop saying that with anything, because there's only one Silicon Valley. So
make your own metaphor.
Leave it where it is. And that's it.
Make your own nickname, make your own metaphor.
Yeah.
And earn it, right?
And earn it. Yeah. And earn it and have it be relevant. So
exactly.
But anyway, from this podcast to your podcast, we'll see you next time. Thanks for tuning in.
Bye-bye.
The Unlikely Innovators with Mike Commito and Steve Gravel. Presented by Cambrian R&D and the Center for Smart Mining.